Hello and welcome to the New Zealand Herald newsroom for our live coverage of Budget 2024. There is certainly a lot of excitement in the air about tax cuts, or should we say bracket adjustments, but it is about how much money you will be getting in your pocket. We'll be looking at that today, but of course also plenty of concerns about debt, the state of the Crown accounts, and how the government and Nicola Willis, in her role as Finance Minister, delivering her first budget, will steer us through all of that. So a big show. We are heading down to Wellington shortly to talk to our Wellington business editor about the highlights, about what the big numbers are that stick out in the immediate aftermath of the budget, which is being delivered now as we speak. Later in the show, we'll have a focus on tax with BDO tax expert Ian Craig. We've got Auckland University tax specialist, tax law specialist Craig Eliff, and we'll also take a look at some of those broader social issues. So we'll be talking to New Zealand Herald social issues reporter Katie Harris and political commentator Shane Tepoe. But first, let's take a look at what the expectations were going into this budget and do a quick recap of what we have heard so far in terms of the spending that has been promised. Tax cuts. How much will you get? Nicola Willis, ahead of her first budget as Finance Minister for the new coalition government, has promised 83% of New Zealanders over 15 will benefit from tax relief, a promise National made during the election campaign.
We were elected on a platform of delivering tax relief to those families, and I don't plan on breaking that promise.
But how much will they cost the country?
Our tax relief will be funded from within the operating allowance through a mixture of savings, reprioritisation and additional revenue sources. This means funding our tax package will not add to net core Crown debt.
That meant the money had to be found through cost-cutting measures, with government agencies told to make cuts of 6.5 or 7.5% to save the $1.5 billion required.
To find $1.5 billion of ongoing annual savings across government agencies. I am confirming today that we have met that savings target.
However, meeting that savings target has come at the cost of more than 5,000 public service roles. Willis has little room to move between the new government's tax cuts, its promise to reduce spending, and the need to outline a plan to get the Crown accounts out of deficit. She is operating within tight constraints with a self-imposed cap of $3.5 billion for all new spending. So, what has already been announced? So far, the government has already announced $140 million in new funding for 1,500 new social housing places to be funded by community housing providers, not Kāinga Ora, thanks to savings found by ending the First Home Grant, despite promising to keep it during the election campaign. $150 million to set up 15 new charter schools and convert 35 state schools next year and in 2026. The government is also putting $67 million into bringing the structured literacy learning method into state schools by the first term of 2025, and free school lunches will get $478 million in the budget for an interim model over the next 2 years. The Family Boost policy will let parents and caregivers claim back up to 25% of childcare costs from July, which will see 21,000 families qualify for the maximum $75 a week. There'll be $571 million more funding over 4 years for defence. $163 million will go toward improving workers' pay. The money will also help upgrade the military's NH90 helicopter fleet. Pharmac's budget is boosted more than $1.7 billion over the next 4 years, increasing the National Drug Purchasing Entity's overall budget to almost $6.3 billion. $1.9 billion will go to corrections to establish more than 800 extra beds at Waikaria Prison and 685 more frontline corrections staff, including 470 prison officers. And a new standalone social investment agency, effective from July, has been allocated just over $50 million. But for the financial markets and the all-important international credit ratings agencies, it will be the total spending and revenue that matters today. How long until the accounts are back in surplus? How much more will the government have to borrow to meet its spending commitments? Are there more job cuts yet to come? And will the net result, the fiscal impulse, add to inflationary pressures or help ease them? Finally, today is Willis's chance to grab the spotlight and sell her vision for the economic recovery and ultimately a more prosperous New Zealand. And we're about to go to Parliament to hear from Wellington business editor Janae Tibsharaini. But yes, tax cuts have been delivered. $14.7 billion tax package is been announced, and it's looking like, the early numbers are something like $20 a week or $40 a week per couple. They're talking about $25 a week for an individual on $55,000. So that's probably the big one, but there's a lot more in it. We're going to cut to Janae now and get the highlights from her. Kia ora, Janae.
Hey Liam, how you doing?
Good. Well, let's start with the big one. Tax cuts delivered. Was that largely as expected, or to what extent have they fulfilled on that promise that they made in the election?
Well, Nicola Willis has delivered the exact tax cuts that National campaigned on. So you will get exactly what National said you'd get, which is up to about $1,000 a year, depending on how much you earn.
So that's, I guess, a success in terms of delivering what they promised. The focus has been on how they're going to pay for that. Was it obvious in the budget where that money is coming from?
Yeah, look, I had been wondering whether they would announce some new types of taxes or additional ways of generating revenue, but they haven't done that, and the money is coming purely from cost savings, reprioritisation, and that is really difficult to follow. I think we will get a clearer sense of exactly what that looks like as we see the effects of those spending cuts. Now, the other difficulty here is that the economy has been growing, much less than expected, and also into the future the Treasury believes economic growth will be quite sluggish. So if the economy grows less, that means the government collects less tax, which means it has less money to spend. So because of that, they're going to need to increase their borrowing by quite a bit more than expected.
Any round numbers on that borrowing? There was talk of $10 to $15 billion of extra bonds. I mean, I guess the government says they're not borrowing for the tax cuts, but they're doing the tax cuts and they are going to have to borrow.
Yeah, that's right. So the increase in debt issuance is about $12 billion over the forecast period. So as you said, Liam, that aligns with what economists were expecting. And if you look at debt as a percentage of GDP, that's also expected to rise quite a bit more than what the Treasury forecast in December. So it will be difficult for Nicola Willis to meet her goal of getting net to GDP to between 20 and 40%, longer term. At the moment, it's a wee bit over that 40% mark.
So they will be arguing hard that they can perhaps push this economy harder than current expectations, perhaps?
Yeah, look, that's the hope, and actually that's where quite a bit of the money went, is towards infrastructure. I think spending on water infrastructure, transport, perhaps housing, maybe not so much for kāinga ora, is what the government will be relying on to stimulate growth. It's quite worrying that the Treasury actually sees productivity falling even more. So, we have more people, but we're not producing as much per person.
Sure. In terms of, you mentioned the infrastructure, are there other any spending surprises there? What are the highlights, stepping aside from that core tax policy?
Yeah, look, actually not many surprises, none that I can think of. This was a pretty predictable budget. Nicola Willis said she'd deliver modest tax cuts. That's what she's done. Cut spending to pay for it, that's what she's done. She hasn't increased taxes, but she has increased borrowing. So that's kind of the pinch, and that's where the promise hasn't been fulfilled. Something else interesting, actually, Liam, in the depths of one of the documents, The Treasury explains that at some point after it finalised its forecasts at the beginning of April, Nicola Willis decided to shrink the size of her operational allowance. That means she committed to spending less on day-to-day operating expenses in this budget and also in the next 3 budgets than she planned at some point before April 5. So I think that's quite interesting. There was a last-minute decision to reduce the size of those operational allowances. Now, the Treasury said, okay, well, that's all fair and well, but there is a risk that there won't be enough money to meet existing cost pressures. So there is a risk at this point that in the future, the government will have to keep cutting expenses, reprioritising, perhaps look at new ways of generating revenue, just to keep delivering the existing level of services.
So I guess in terms of that, pathway forward, the vision we're expected to hear from Nicola Willis, that suggests that we are. I mean, this might not be an austerity budget. We're getting tax cuts, but over the next 3 years, it looks like it's going to all be pretty tight for some time. More cuts to come.
Yeah, definitely. I think over the past few years we got used to budgets being these kind of exciting events where we'd see new spending initiatives and quite interesting different schemes and so on. Those days are now well and truly over, and I wouldn't say we're in austere times, but we are definitely keeping things tight. As I said at the beginning, it's difficult, when you're looking at these numbers and looking at the books and looking at hundreds of millions of dollars and billions of dollars of cuts. It's difficult to know exactly what that means until we see those people in the public sector, leave their jobs and we see programs cut and we see what the impact of that actually is. Now, before we totally despair, health spending is up, education and infrastructure. So, there are some bright spots there.
So that's almost sort of back to basic spending. That's the stuff that all governments want to do, and I guess this government's got its ways of, its policies for delivering. So nothing specific on infrastructure, just a big number. No new, there's not big projects announced or anything like that.
Yeah, look, I didn't get into the weeds of that, but the roads of national significance, that's, a key focus. Beyond that, I guess I'm going to have to look through and see what's in the budget, see what's been previously said.
The same with the cuts, right?
Today or tomorrow.
It's the same with the cuts. They talked about 240 areas, but if you're talking, the kind of cuts that we might see over the next few years, that's going to take some time to come through, I guess, to actually work through and find out where, if it's a series of micro cuts and they're doing this perhaps, judiciously line by line, that'll take a while to work out. I guess we'll start hearing from people when their program's been cut.
Yeah, look, there is a summary of initiatives among the bunch of budget documents, and that lists, what's going, what's staying, and it goes sort of line by line, as you said. One change that is quite interesting that is being made, and this is what was signalled in the coalition agreement that National had with, I think it was New Zealand First, or maybe ACT, sorry, I can't quite remember, was the fees free for tertiary education. Currently, you can get your first year of tertiary education free. They're going to change that so you can get your last year of education free. So that will save a wee bit of money, because obviously there are more people who start university and fewer people who end it.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because actually if you stick at it, you're probably saving more money, getting more money from the government for those third year fees, but I guess the numbers drop as they go through. Look, just to recap again, Janae, because I know a lot,
exactly.
There's a lot in it, but the focus on tax cuts, can you just run us through again what's been delivered in that tax package?
Okay, sure. So basically the government is adjusting those income tax brackets to account for some of the inflation that we've seen since 2010, when those brackets were last adjusted. So the way they're making those adjustments won't actually fully account for all the inflation we've had, but it'll account for a wee bit of it. The way they're adjusting those brackets is the same as what National campaigned on. People on lower incomes won't get as much of a tax cut as people on higher incomes. The most you will get for middle and higher income earners will be about $1,000 $1,043, I think it is. For lower income earners, there are also some other adjustments to the various tax credits and so on, but they are the same as have been previously announced.
Sure, and the timing of these tax cuts, there's been a bit of a focus on that. You mentioned covering the cost of inflation, but we know the Reserve Bank is going to be looking closely at this document just to get a sense of whether the sort of the fiscal impulse is actually inflationary in terms of putting dollars in people's pockets this year while they're trying to fight inflation. What's your sense there? I mean, I know we can't predict how the Reserve Bank will see it, but how do you think that's going to look?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I went around some of the economists in the lockup, and they were still trying to do the maths on that. That's quite a difficult calculation to do. Now, the income tax cuts will happen from the 31st of July. That's about a month later than what National campaigned on. The fiscal impulse is still positive, so that means, it's still expansionary compared to the previous year. But it's just a matter of doing the math, because you're taking money out by reducing the size of the public sector, but then you're putting money in by delivering those cuts. So how that all sort of balances out is yet to be seen. I don't think the impact will be super major when it comes to the impact on inflation, just based on the conversations I had in the lockup just now with some of the experts.
Sure, and you'd hope that they've sort of looked at all this stuff in the big picture and had to think about where the Reserve Bank is going, and that there's some, I know they're independent, but it's nice to see ideally fiscal policy working with monetary policy.
Well, that's the thing, and I think Nicola Willis is aware of that. If she delivers too much in terms of tax cuts, then people will get hurt because inflation could be higher. Their mortgage rates remain higher. Businesses take a hit because the economy slows. The economy slowing means people lose their jobs. So all those benefits from the tax cut go out of the door if inflation isn't curbed. So I feel like a pretty good balance has been struck here between delivering on what was promised, but not doing anything more, not doing anything less either. The other tax changes that people will be aware of, which were previously announced, were the changes to interest deductibility, that is allowing residential property investors to deduct interest as an expense. Big saving for property investors. Also reducing the bright line test back to 2 years. That's a sort of de facto capital gains tax. Another big win for investors. And then the downside for commercial property investors is the government's decision to stop allowing those investors to deduct depreciation as an expense. So, if you look at the whole tax package, we have income earners getting a tax cut, residential property investors getting a tax cut, owners of commercial and industrial builders getting a tax hike. So interestingly, the National Party, which is a party for business, is increasing taxes for commercial and industrial property owners. Those are businesses.
So, they're obviously going to, it's a very difficult budget for the government, this balancing act. They're going to be open to both being patted on the back for maybe getting the balance right, but that does leave them open, I guess, when you do that kind of balancing act, to being criticised by both the right and the left for the spending cuts, perhaps more than people would want to see, and then the right for not getting out of deficit as quickly. Are we on for a mild surplus in 2027-28?
Yeah, that's right. So that surplus 27-28, that's been pushed out a year compared to what the Treasury forecast back in December. So, I guess we've got to look at everything in perspective. We have had a pandemic. It takes a wee while to get the books back in the black. But of course, those on the left will be disappointed by the downsizing of the public sector. And it's not just a one-off, it's not just these job cuts that we're seeing now. It looks like it's going to need to be into the future as well. The impact on that is very much yet to be seen. And you're right, those on the right have been upset by the tax cuts. We're increasing our borrowing, that comes at a cost. and we're actually, I talked to an economist in the lockup, and the way they described the situation was that it's sort of like if you're an individual and you lose your job, you've had a pay cut, so you take out an overdraft to keep covering your costs, but then you want a new couch, so you buy a new couch, but you stop your Netflix subscription to pay for the couch. So you still have your overdraft because you've got less income. You have your new couch, but you don't have your Netflix. I don't know if that analogy makes sense.
No, it's a kind of internal economics and maths that we do all the time in our heads. Whether or not in a big fiscal picture it adds up, well, we'll wait and see how markets react. Hey, look, Janae, thanks so much for that. I think we're ready to cut to hear from Nicola Willis in her speech from lockup, and we're going to cut to her now and hear from the Finance Minister herself.
Budget 2024 delivers. It delivers on our key commitments, and it is a budget for New Zealanders who have been experiencing a prolonged cost of living crisis. It's a budget for Kiwis who want to see better frontline services in health and education, who want law and order to be restored, and who want to see some light at the end of the tunnel in this difficult economic downturn.
Alrighty.
It is those New Zealanders who have been at the forefront of our minds as we have put Budget 2024 together. We are taking decisive action to provide tax relief that gives average income households up to $102 per fortnight, plus Family Boost childcare payments of up to $150 per fortnight. Targeted and affordable investments in public services, with 2/3 of new spending going into health, education and law and order. Enduring savings across government, both to responsibly fund tax relief and to boost frontline services. The biggest part of this budget is, in fact, investment in public services. Infrastructure investments to lay the foundations for growth, and a pathway to get the country back to surplus with lower debt. As you know, Budget 2024 is set against a backdrop of a difficult economic downturn. But with our responsible, careful approach, we are able to see better times ahead. Interest rates have been increased to tackle high inflation, and the subsequent downturn has been deeper and more persistent than previously expected. Treasury is forecasting the economy to pick up in 2024, and its forecasts also show inflation returning to the target band of 1 to 3% later this year, and interest rates falling. So, while times may feel tough for everyday Kiwis right now, the economy will recover and inflation will come down. Our government has a plan to help those things happen. The tax package I am announcing today aligns with the National Party's tax plan, with some small adjustments to reflect coalition agreements. On the campaign trail, I pledged that our tax plan would give an average income household up to $100 a fortnight, and an average income household with children up to $250 a fortnight. I have kept that pledge. Not every household will get that much, but our package intentionally targets low and middle income families with children, and it delivers what we said it would. The personal tax package is made up of several parts which work together to ensure that the overall benefits are tilted towards low to middle income working families with children. Analysis by Treasury shows that an estimated 727,000 households will benefit by at least $75 a fortnight, 187,000 will benefit by at least $100 a fortnight, and on average, households will benefit by $60 a fortnight, while households with children will benefit by $78 a fortnight on average.
Tax relief in Budget 2024 is fully funded from savings and revenue initiatives. And I can confirm that because of this, the government is not borrowing to fund this tax relief, and it will not add to inflation. This slide shows how our tax package is funded. Our tax package puts $3.7 billion a year back into the pockets of New Zealanders. The largest contributor to paying for this is $1.2 billion a year of baseline savings we have found through our savings program. And the rest of our tax relief is funded by a range of changes, including closing labour programs, many of which have previously been outlined at our mini budget, depreciation changes for the taxation of commercial buildings, revenue from immigration levies, and replacing the first year fees-free program with final year fees-free. I want to acknowledge that the funding of the tax plan does not involve a tax on foreign buyers, and I want to acknowledge New Zealand First's contribution, both in terms of the policy to make first year fees-free, final year fees-free, but also the investment in tax compliance activities, which generates additional revenue to support our tax plan. We are addressing pressures in the health system by investing to reduce waiting times, to improve our hospitals, and to get Kiwis the health care they need and deserve. Our health boost includes critical funding for Pharmac to pay for the drugs Kiwis rely on, but which the previous government did not continue funding. It supports the Gumboot Friday mental health service and gradually extends free breast screening to 70 to 74-year-olds. We are committed to supporting frontline healthcare workers, and I am pleased to say we are already seeing a surge in the numbers employed. In 2024, Health New Zealand has already overseen growth in the nursing workforce of more than 1,000 full-time equivalent roles so far. And senior medical officer numbers have grown by more than 80 full-time equivalents in the first quarter of 2024 alone. We have taken the responsible step to pre-commit health funding for our next 2 budgets, meaning there is certainty for those leading and working in our health system. Make no mistake, boosting funding for health will always be a priority for this government. Turning to education, the government is investing to support schools and early childhood education providers, to build new schools and classrooms, to support schools to teach reading through a structured literacy approach, and to continue the Healthy School Lunches program. This budget includes the biggest boost dedicated to school property maintenance funding in several years. We are fixing up substandard classrooms. We will be training more teachers, we will be establishing charter schools, and we will be relentlessly focused on lifting achievement in our education system. The Coalition Government is committed to cracking down on crime, and Budget 2024 invests in initiatives to keep communities safe. We are investing $2.9 billion in extra capital and operating funding to restore law and order. This includes more corrections officers, more frontline police, and updated police vehicles and tools. We will also be taking steps to address youth offending, including a military-style academy pilot. I want to acknowledge New Zealand First here, because in this budget we are delivering on our government's commitment to boost the police force with 500 additional frontline police. There are many other investments we are able to make in this budget because of our careful, responsible use of taxpayer dollars. These include support for disabled people to access the essential services and equipment they need, boosting our Defence Force pay and upgrading their vehicles, helicopters and infrastructure, delivering 1,500 more social housing places through community housing providers, and supporting the Te Matatini National Festival.
The surplus by 2027-28, how ambitious is that, and will you get there?
We will get there. We're determined to get there because we need to get our books back in balance to start paying down debt. Otherwise, all we're doing is saddling future generations with that debt. We think it's important. What we also note is that it's only possible with more disciplined spending. If we'd stuck to the spending plans of the outgoing government, surplus would not be achieved until 2030-31. That is far too long to wait, and it's why we've taken care to bring a more disciplined approach to operating allowances.
How can you be confident your tax cuts will make a meaningful difference?
Because I've knocked on the doors of New Zealanders who've told me their struggles. The people who've said that, $20 a fortnight is the difference between them paying their bills or being in overdraft. I've talked to the New Zealanders who've told me they've had to reduce how much milk they buy their kids because they can't make the household budget add up anymore. The tax reduction we're offering is modest, but it is meaningful and it will make a difference.
Okay, welcome back to the NZ Herald studio. With me I have BDO tax partner Ian Craig. Welcome, Ian.
Thanks, Liam.
What's your first impression?
Well, what you see is what you get. She's delivered on what she promised she would deliver, and she's not made any adjustments to the brackets other than what she announced in the pre-election. So the brackets have been adjusted in theory for inflation. It's the first time that the tax brackets have been adjusted since 2010. And I think that it's giving some tax relief and extra cash in the pocket of many taxpayers because it's affecting those lower bands of tax.
Sure. So just take us through, like, a step back and remind us how, we've talked a lot about tax cuts, but these are bracket adjustments. What are we talking about here? Remind us of the bands that we're talking about and how it works and how they will actually deliver this money into our back pocket.
So, we have a progressive tax system. So the tax rates go from 10.5 to 17.5 to 30 to 33, and then the top rate at 39% on personal income. And it's a bracket is where that tax rate changes. So it's going from 48 to 51,500, I think. I've got the, and so it's in keeping with it. So as income has gone through and people have earned more money, they've ended up paying more tax, and arguably that income has increased because of inflation. And so people are paying more tax than they would have otherwise expected to some time ago. And I think I'm used to, and I would expect brackets to be regularly adjusted for inflation, not every year, but every so often. And I think after 14 years, you could argue it's well overdue.
Yeah, sure. So the issue is not probably that this is happening overdue, but there are some concerns about the timing, obviously, because this is a tough budget, not of Nicola Willis's making, but they've got some really tough constraints in terms of being in deficit, and also the idea that giving people a bit of money right now might actually boost inflation. I mean, does the timing of it cause any issues from your perspective?
Well, if you regard it's overdue, it's overdue, and just because maybe the economy is not doing so well, is arguably not an excuse to make those changes. And if you look back, if I look across the ditch to Australia, they have also introduced similar changes, but they've used a combination of lowering tax rates at the lower brackets and extending the brackets at higher rates. So they've made some tax changes, and they've actually called it a cost of living tax cut. That was the title of their Amendment Act. So I think it's something that arguably had to happen. And the only reason to defer it would be because of the state of the economy. Well, it might just help the economy, because some people have more. They may have some more money in their pocket to help with retail, help boost retail, help boost spending, which could be inflationary, I guess. I'm not an expert in that area.
Yeah, no, that's right. No, but I mean, they've made the case, I guess, that if you've promised to do something, and if not now, when, you might never do it. If you're waiting for the economy to be in great shape, it might never happen, I guess, because the way that we tend to look at economies.
That's right. I look at it, I think having it applying from 31 July, so I guess that's
interesting. We're used to 1 July, right? So is there a reason for that? Does it? I mean, it's a month. It doesn't. They're not delaying to save money.
Yeah. Well, look, in the past we've had changes made at 1 April, which is the start of our tax year, or 1 October. So I thought it was always interesting when it was being discussed as happening from 1 July, and it's now 31 July, so the end of July. Maybe it's to just give a 4-month. Make it in chunks of 4 months and 8 months in this first year, so you'll have a composite calculation, and then the full relief will be enjoyed in the 24-25 year when you get the whole income year at the lower rates. It might be to give the software payroll providers an extra month to make sure that their software is coping with those changes.
Sure. And I mean, from a business point of view, are there any, this kind of tax adjustment, does it cause any kind of headaches for business and paying people, or is that sort of built into the system to just change from the base up?
The great majority of businesses will be using a payroll software provider to help calculate their payroll. If somebody is doing it manually or in an Excel spreadsheet or using the Inland Revenue's calculator, they'll want to be doubly sure they're getting it correct. But I think, I don't see it causing an enormous change to them as long as they've got good systems for making that change.
Sure. Look, thanks so much for being here, Ian. We're going to leave it there. We're going to cut back to Wellington. But thanks again for your insights.
My
Cheers.
pleasure. Thanks, Liam.
All right, Robin, first take. What do we think?
Yeah, it's a solid budget. I call it.
Cool. That's great.
A solid back to basics budget.
So that seems to align pretty closely with what the government forecasted. Do you think, in terms of the tax policy that they've proposed, how does that align?
Yeah, it's pretty much spot on with what National had proposed in their election policy. One thing that they did signal in the coalition agreements was that any tax cuts would have to factor in what ACT would like to see in terms of changes to tax rates. What they've decided through this process is that that's not possible at this particular time, but they will consider it for the future. So we can hope for some more changes in future budgets potentially.
Yeah, well, what do you make of that future consideration, leaving the door open for that development?
I think the key thing now is that, this is really just rectifying the wrongs of the past in terms of tax thresholds not changing since 2010. So I think it is tax relief, but it's just putting people back in the position that they should have been if we were inflation indexing tax rates to start with. So I think definitely it's something that we need to continue to look at into the future.
Any surprises that you've come across so far?
Not any major surprises. One area where we were expecting a bit more funding to go to was compliance activities for Inland Revenue. So as it stands, when Inland Revenue is funded to do investigations and audits, and that normally returns $8 for every dollar invested. So we were anticipating that more funding would be going to Inland Revenue, and that was part of the New Zealand First Coalition Agreement. We have seen more funding, but it's only $29 million per year. So I would have anticipated a greater amount of funding, but that's what we're going to be seeing.
And anything that that businesses should be aware of from this budget?
Yeah, the key thing for businesses will just be getting ready for the threshold changes. So the interesting thing is that they have been pushed out from the original proposal of starting on 1 July 2024, which obviously would have been a month away, which is a tight time frame for software providers to update all of those PAYE tables and do all of the adjustments required for all of the sort of ancillary consequences for other personal taxes. We have seen this pushed out to 31 July just to allow more time for that software to be built. The question mark that I have there is just how that will practically work out. The last day of the month seems like an unusual start date, but we'll see how it all works in the end.
And if you're sitting at home, looking at this tax relief plan, what would you be encouraging them to do?
Yeah, I would just go to the Treasury website and look up the calculator. So a lot of the tax relief, it's a muddle of a number of things. So we've got threshold changes to independent earner tax credit, some working for families changes in the Family Boost product as well. And how much you benefit really depends on your personal circumstances, whether you're a couple, whether you're in work, how many children you have, how old your children are, etc. So the calculator there actually facilitates you to put in all of your own personal details, and it will give you an accurate number.
Hi, welcome back to the New Zealand Herald newsroom. With me I have University of Auckland or Auckland University tax specialist Craig Eliff. Hi Craig, thanks for having you here. Thanks for being here. Look, Nicola Willis has delivered as billed. Were there any surprises there for you around the tax?
Not for me. I think it's like it's appropriate and fair to be addressing this issue of inflation on our tax rates. Over a long period of time, we have had a progressive, a non-deliberate progressive increase in our tax rates through the effect of inflation. So it is refreshing to have another hard look at that. It does leave me wondering, though. There's a lot of money that has been that is now missing from our tax take, and so. Whilst I applaud the principle behind this, I'm worried about the consequence that will flow through, because 3.7 billion on top of the property investors, sort of 2.9 billion, which is spread over a longer period of time, means that there is simply revenue from our traditional base which is missing. We have a simple base, and we've just taken away quite a lot of that simple base, around about 5%.
Yeah, that's right. And when it comes to paying for it, you either boost the economy, I guess, and this must be what the government is hoping to do, or you cut, or you borrow. And the government is borrowing 12 billion more here. Nicola Willis, again, very adamant she is not borrowing for tax cuts. They're borrowing for something else to cover that isn't the tax cuts. I don't know quite how that works, but
well, why am I not persuaded by that argument? I mean, I think money is fungible, isn't it? You have an option with let's just take the 3.7. You have the option of spending it, or if you haven't actually raised it, and yet your net position is one of being indebted and you don't have a surplus, then you have to borrow. So I think no matter which side of the mouth you say that out of, there is additional borrowing.
Yeah. But I mean, look, the Treasury says the economy is going to keep slowing for a bit, so that's tough. But are there other tax revenue areas that the government could look to?
There are, but they don't seem to be within the appetite of the current coalition government. But there are certainly some larger, more strategic things that New Zealand should be doing, and that you probably don't want to get me started on, to be honest with you.
Yeah, but they aren't in this budget. That's the point.
Not only are they not in it, what we see charted is a position of restricted spending and through this correctly right principle, lower taxation. My one concern, you were thinking about observations, I would hate it if the additional money that gets paid to the hardworking New Zealanders that the government's talking about, I'd hate it if in fact the net effect of all of this is that they lose that money because their interest rates are kept higher for a longer period of time than was otherwise necessary. And I think there is a risk of that, because we know we've got an environment where the economy is on a daily basis getting kind of worse, and yet we don't have the Reserve Bank cutting our rates. And
they're going to look closely at this, and they're going to look at the fiscal impulse and say, well, is this money in our pockets then feeding through into more inflation? I mean, they've adjusted the timing a bit. Maybe the timing will be crucial in terms of the cuts themselves are being delivered over a period of time. We start getting this tax cut from first pay cycle after July 31. Is that right?
Yeah, no, that's right. And this is strange. Normally, traditionally, if there are changes, they are made on the 1st of April of the year, or alternatively, they're on the 1st of October. So you've either got, sort of 12 months or 6 months. On this occasion, we're 4 months into the year. It's going to create some really odd calculations. There'll be composite rates for various forms of ancillary taxes outside of the PAYEs, things like FBT and other taxes. So this is about this. For a simple tax reform, this is about the most complex way you could go about it.
Right. Do you think, could that actually cause problems for businesses?
Yeah, absolutely. It will cause cost for businesses.
Right.
They will have to amend their software and their programs, and they'll need to make sure that they make their calculations correct. There are poor consequences if you get it wrong. So they've got to work hard on this. Yeah,
and obviously they're going to have to work hard to deliver the cuts to balance. So I guess we kind of have to wait and see how much more is to come on that front.
Well, I think that's right. Sort of the big longer-term picture here is sort of like, where are we heading? Are we heading to a country that is more supportive of its social services or less supportive? And whilst I hope no one is thinking that I'm being critical of these index changes, because I think they're absolutely correct, I'm worried about the overall fiscal position. It's not just me being worried, it's the IMF, the OECD. They have all been quite clear about this, that in actual fact our long-term prognosis, and indeed Treasury themselves, our long-term prognosis is not great. We simply will not be able to carry forward in a long-term strategic manner on our tax with our existing systems.
Sure, it's interesting, isn't it? Sort of an austere tone, even though we're getting some money back in our pocket, and possibly not austerity, but an austere tone for some budgets to come. Look, thank you so much, Craig. We're going to cut back to Wellington again now. Thanks for being here today. Cheers.
It's an absolute pleasure, Liam.
Okay, Mr. Baggery, overall thoughts from today's budget?
Not too much of a surprise in regard to what the numbers are telling us. We get back to surplus slowly over time, but in the near term we're in a little bit of what's called a fiscal hole. The only reason we get back to surplus is by some pretty incredulous spending restraint over subsequent budgets. Those budget allowances for 2025, 26 and 2027, there's not a lot of money to go around, and certainly not enough money to maintain this current level of service within the core government sector, so they're going to need either more revenue or they're going to need more savings.
Do you think the government forecasted that fairly?
Well, those numbers are historically very tight. So just whether they're credible or not will be the million-dollar question, but what we know is that, look, there has been an awful lot of money that's been pumped into the government sector over the past 5 odd years. So they're taking out a bit of fat in round one. The danger is that when you move into round two and possibly round three, you start cutting into muscle.
And so how might they look at doing that? Could they possibly do another 6.5, 7.5% savings exercise again, or is that off the table now?
Well, as I said, they're going to need more money, or they're going to need more savings, because those operating allowances look wafer thin going forward. So this budget's about a $3.2 billion package, which is pretty tight, but they're expecting a step down to $2.4 billion packages in out years. So what we've seen in regard to spending restraint so far looks like the appetizer on what could be an unwelcome main course.
And how do we think Adrian Orr and the Reserve Bank are feeling at this moment?
Well, the government has delivered what's called a tight fiscal strategy, tight fiscal stance over the projection period. The problem is the fiscal stance is slightly stimulatory, that's adding to aggregate demand in the next 12 months. And that's a period where the Reserve Bank has probably got most concern in regard to their inflation trajectory, so that they needed a little bit of help in the near term from the government today, and those forecasts didn't provide the help in the near term. And they provided help over 4 years, but the Reserve Bank needs that help up front in the next 12 months.
So if you're sitting at home, should we be thinking that rates are going to go up?
Well, the Reserve Bank discussed raising rates at the last monetary policy decision. They ultimately decided not to move, largely because the economy is in a very strong weakening phase, and the Reserve Bank and most of the economist fraternity is penciling in some pretty weak numbers over the next 12 months. Treasury today itself is forecasting a recession, negative growth over the coming sort of 12 months. So getting rid of that inflation problem involves tough times, economic hits, and those economic hits are being dished out as we speak.
And is this budget, do you think, going to adequately address inflation, get it down?
It will help over the projection period, but the Reserve Bank was relying on more help up front, and that will be an unwelcome surprise to the Reserve Bank. But monetary policy and fiscal policy are just some of those levers that can drive disinflationary outcomes. You've got to look at the broader economy, and what we know at the moment is that the broader economy is pretty soft. But that tax package in the next 12 months is going to pump a bit more money into the economy that's going to add to demand, and that's potentially going to add to inflation.
So still a pretty tough next 12, 18, 24 months to come?
Well, the Reserve Bank will win the disinflation crusade. It's in their remit. So that they will achieve it. The problem is, how much economic pain are they going to dish out to make sure that they achieve it over the next 12 to 24 months?
Hi, welcome back. Briefly, we are going to go back down to Wellington now because we are hearing the first response from Labour leader Christopher Hipkins, who is going to, I guess, give us a bit of a critique of what he has heard today.
With the increasing cost of living and the changes made in this budget, we'll see Kiwis paying more. New Zealanders will be worse off. Let's go back to the Reserve Bank and what they said just in the last week about what's keeping inflation higher for longer and run this budget up against those tests. Rates are going up at astronomical levels. Nothing in this budget will tackle that. Rents are going up at high levels. Nothing in this budget is going to tackle that. The $2.9 billion in tax breaks for landlords has so far resulted in rents going up more. Insurance is going up because of the increase in natural disasters, among other things we're seeing in New Zealand, and nothing in this budget is going to address that. This is a budget that is going to leave New Zealanders worse off. But let's look at it against some of the other commitments that the National Party have made. They made much of this notion of fiscal cliffs, that time-limited funding was such a terrible thing. Are there new fiscal cliffs in this year's budget? Yes, there are 7. And it turns out that police operational funding is now a fiscal cliff under this year's budget. The government said that they were going to be increasing health and education spending at least by the level of inflation. Remember that? Nicola Willis said that during the election campaign, at least by the level of inflation. I think her calculator must be broken, because when early childhood education providers get an increase of just 2% and schools get an increase of only 3% for some schools and not for others, that's not keeping up with inflation. In fact, as a former Minister of Education, I can tell you this means that schools will be laying off teacher aides as a result of this year's meagre budget increase. That's more jobs that are going to be cut because the government is effectively cutting funding for schools and cutting funding for early childhood education providers. Social services are going backwards. Health and education are going backwards. The increases in this year's funding are less than those required. Te Whatu Ora made it very clear before the election to any incoming government what was going to be required just to meet cost pressures, and this government's budget does not meet those requirements. And they have not allowed additional funding to meet their new targets that they have said. So they can have no credibility, no funding to meet the targets that they've set the health system. In fact, the health system is going to be expected to meet those at a time when its funding in real terms is going backwards. What does that mean? It means other frontline health services will have to be cut in order to meet the targets that the government has set. And we have seen that before. We saw that under the Key government when targets for the health system were set and not properly funded. Other frontline health services suffered as a result of that. Mr. Speaker, no responsible modern government in 2024 would be cutting the level of investment that we make as a country in tackling climate change. And yet that is exactly what this government are doing. One of the things you won't see in this year's budget, Mr. Speaker, is the accounting for the massive financial liability that is coming down the pipeline at us if we don't meet our emissions reductions targets. Billions of dollars will need to be paid out by the New Zealand government if we fail to meet our emissions reductions targets. Not $1 has been provided for that in this year's budget. They are simply kicking that can down the road, increasing the liability the New Zealand government will face in the future, potentially by billions of dollars, and just forgetting about that in this year's budget. And in fact, doing worse than that, they're cutting the very things that would help us to avoid that future liability by decreasing our emissions. Cutting emissions Cutting the initiatives designed to reduce our emissions is not the thing that responsible 21st century governments do. Mr. Speaker, another thing that the government have been very quiet on is the issue of child poverty. I'm not surprised, because this year's budget makes it clear child poverty in New Zealand is increasing, and it is going to continue to increase, and the measures that the government have implemented in this budget mean more children are going to be pushed below the poverty line. Here's another thing that responsible 21st century governments don't do. They don't celebrate more children being forced below the poverty line, as this government are. Mr. Speaker, the government has choices. The government could choose to prioritise keeping New Zealanders in work. It could choose to prioritise lifting children out of poverty rather than forcing more children into poverty. It could choose to prioritise tackling climate change. It is not making those choices. Instead, it's choosing to prioritise tax cuts that are going to lead to higher inflation for longer. And let's
Okay, we are back in the New Zealand Herald newsroom. With me I have Katie Harris, New Zealand Herald Social Issues reporter. Hi, Katie.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, great. Look, I mean, we heard Chris Hipkins there talk about child poverty, some of those issues with how tough things are out there. When you look at this budget so far, what would you say are highlights, or are there any, for some of those areas?
I mean, obviously there's a lot in there for, middle income earners and for people with children. We've got, for example, a working for families in work tax credit increase, which will give some families $50 a fortnight. But I've just gotten off the phone with a disability advocate who really fears that people at the lower end of the spectrum they're already struggling. And after this budget, he says there's nothing in it for them. He claims that it's a budget of 1,000 cuts for people at that lower end of the spectrum.
So we know that beneficiaries not benefiting from the tax breaks. So nothing standing out in terms of big initiatives around, poverty or even sort of social disabilities, that sort of thing?
I mean, there are a few things in there. For example, there's an extra $1.1 billion for the Ministry of Disabled People. That being said, the advocate that I spoke to didn't believe that was enough, didn't think it would do anything.
I guess that's across 4 years, is it?
Yeah, across 5 years. And so it's interesting. I mean, when you look at, say, a minimum income wage earner, they're better off by about $12.50 a week. So, I mean, like, for a lot of people, that's not much at all. That's a few loaves of bread and maybe a thing of milk.
And effectively, I guess, relatively, if it is going to continued inflation, they're going backwards compared to the middle income earners who are getting the full benefit of the tax cut.
Yeah, and I mean, I've spoken to people that are struggling to even find a place to live, people living in cars, and we know there is a housing crisis, and from what I've heard today from people I've spoken to, this is going to make it tougher, just because everyone else feels like for them perhaps, median and high income people are getting all these benefits, and people on low incomes or on benefits are not getting supported, in their opinion, at all.
Yeah, what about issues like, I mean, I know you're not necessarily education specialist, but are there things there for education generally, or that kind of thing that might help lift people out of poverty?
Yeah, there has been some boost for education. I mean, we did hear earlier this month that the Food in Schools program wasn't going to be scrapped, it was being saved, even though David Seymour had campaigned on scrapping that. There's a few other things for schools. So the government announced a $3 billion package for education, which included a $1.1 billion boost for new schools and classrooms, as well as $67 million for structured literacy. So there is a lot in there, and I think there are benefits, say, for example, with the Family Boost package, which is for daycare fees, which will help some families. I've got some examples here. So say if you are, where are we? I mean, some families will save, a few $100s a fortnight if they've got multiple children in daycare, depending on what their salaries are.
Again, that's sort of probably, working people, right? But I guess, again, looking at that lower end of society, beneficiaries, there must be a sense in those groups and those advocates for those groups that they've really been left behind in this one.
I think so. From what I've heard and what I've been told, it sort of feels like everyone's getting a little bit and they're being left behind, and they, the advocate I spoke to already felt like people were living in poverty and living in really dire conditions, and this was just another nail in the coffin. We did hear from the Green Party, and they said that there was this was a budget of little hope and even less ambition, and they they said it kind of like focused on tax cuts and not poverty or climate change.
I guess this government has talked about getting people off benefits. Difficult when unemployment is rising, but is there a sort of sense of, I don't want to say punitive, but the idea that, they're making it harder to be on a benefit, so it's supposed to incentivise people to find the work that is
I guess
maybe
people
not
that
there.
are in really dire straits, it would be hard to focus on finding a job when you can't find food or a place to live. The Herald has reported countless times this year of people living in cars. I've personally spoken to people living in cars, and at the end of the day, if you're in that situation, your main priority is keeping your children safe and finding food.
Okay, so we're just recapping that we're talking about, for most people, $20 a week here in terms of a tax cut, maybe a little bit more for if you're in that working for families, but just again, in terms of what you've picked up so far in terms of social, that bottom end of the social spectrum, nothing there, and just what was that number again for if you were on a low income, or was it?
So here's some wages. So say if you're on a minimum wage, you'll be better off by $12.50 a week. Now, say a single worker earning $55,000 a year will be better off by about $25 a week. As you go up in wages, it does go up. It does kind of peter off at the end. But I think from what I can see, there's a lot of benefit for people with young children that might benefit from the family boost package, or for people that are on, say, 70 or 80K. But for people that are on lower wages, it's not huge numbers we're talking about here. It's probably not going to make a huge impact on their day-to-day lives.
Yeah, and they're sitting there waiting, I guess, for inflation to come down and a sense that, we're through the cost of living crisis, but it's, worth pointing out that prices aren't going to fall. This is just disinflation. We're going to see the rate at which they rise come down, and potentially there's a risk there, as others have mentioned, that these tax cuts get spent in the economy and kind of keep inflation going for longer, so that actually could mean more pain.
It's hard to overstate just how dire the situation is for some people. The advocate I just spoke to said that he was scared to go to the supermarket because of the prices.
Yeah, was there anything there? You talked about disabilities. Was there anything there, mental health space, anything like that? Labor got bashed up big time for spending on mental health and allegedly not delivering. Was there anything in this budget along those lines? Because I guess, that is a real pinch point, mental health, when you've got people in that level of poverty.
I haven't had a chance to go through all the documents yet because I wasn't in the lockup. But what I can tell you is that we did hear about the $24 million for Mike King's Gumboot Friday charity.
True,
So there was that boost. And when I go into it in more detail, I'll be able to update Herald readers.
Sure. Okay, so just again, any other, just being told we are going to throw back to Wellington for a little bit more Chris Hipkins, and then we'll come back to talk to Shane DePoe. So, look, thanks, Katie. I'll let you get back into it and go through line by line. I know you've got to do a bit more analysis and then produce something for the paper. So, yeah.
Great, thank you.
Go for it. Cheers.
The work that you have done, and we thank you for it. To first home buyers who are finding that the dream of first home ownership is being ripped away from them by this government, we see you and we hear you as well. You deserve better than you are getting from this government. To all the community organisations out there working on the front line who asked for more funding certainty, we see you and we hear you, and we also say that funding to your organisations should not be contingent on your support for the current government. Mr. Speaker, 5,000 jobs cut and counting, that's just in the public sector, with tens of thousands of jobs across the country going under this year's budget. Rising unemployment, higher inflation, more borrowing, a longer time to repay debt, business confidence down, the infrastructure sector left in ongoing limbo, laying off staff who are leaving the country because of the actions of this government. We absolutely recognise you. To local authorities up and down the country who have been lumbered with the huge bill for upgrading water infrastructure because this government have simply abandoned any notion that they could have a role in fixing up the country's water infrastructure, we recognise the pressure that you are under, and we particularly recognise the pressure that ratepayers are now going to be under as a result of this government's decision. To those who support smoke-free Aotearoa and see smoking has no role in New Zealand's future, we recognise you too, and we will continue to fight for that. Mr. Speaker, there are tough choices to be made. This is a difficult point in the economic cycle, but this government's choices are making things tougher for the majority of hard-working New Zealanders. They are taking New Zealand backwards. Mr. Speaker, I note that Nicola Willis and Christopher Luxon said they would resign if they didn't deliver tax cuts. They've clearly chosen to prioritise their jobs over the jobs of the thousands of New Zealanders whose jobs are now at risk as a result of this year's budget. Mr. Speaker, on the number one test that was set for this budget by the government themselves, not borrowing for tax cuts, they failed. Let's look at the numbers, stark as they are again. $10 billion worth of tax cuts, $12 billion worth of borrowing. A fiscal impulse that is positive, i.e. the government's injecting more stimulus into the economy at a time when the Reserve Bank is trying to bring inflation down. This government's budget will result in interest rates staying higher for longer. The warnings issued by the Reserve Bank just in the...
Okay, that's enough of Chris Hipkins. With me I have political commentator Shane Tepoe. Kia ora, Shane.
Kia ora.
Look, let's just start broad. What do you make of it? Highlights and lowlights?
I think it's perverse. I think me as a landlord getting $7,000 in my back pocket, a high earner getting more money than someone on a minimum wage, than someone in superannuation. I think it's about what this government's policy priorities are at. I think as a result of today, more of our children will be cast into poverty, and I think it will be generational.
Yeah, do you think there's going to be, I mean, I was talking to Katie there about, they've thrown a bit of money the way of the so-called squeeze middle, so middle income earners are getting their $20, but if you're on a benefit or something, you're going to see that you're quite specifically missing out here.
Oh, well, the Prime Minister will get $20. I will get $20, but someone on $75,000 will get $15. So it's regressive in respect to that. It's, you know, it's looked after the top end of town. I don't think middle New Zealand. The other thing is that, you know, I'm just an average person. I go and do my grocery shopping. I go and pay my go and get my petrol. Our power bills are going to go up by $15 a month as a result of the Commerce Commission allowing Transpower to do that. I think most Kiwis will look for a bit of hope in terms of this budget and aren't going to get it. And here's the other thing. We've passed it on to our kids, haven't we? Yeah. We're going to borrow another $12 billion while landlords like me get a free ride.
So this is the choice, I guess, a government makes. But you know, the moment we were joking about this before, you've kind of almost got allies on the right here. You're known as a, but because they could cut spending less, and cut, not do as much of these spending cuts that might suit you, but they also and the economists I talk to are concerned about our deficit and would like to see them get out of deficit faster. I guess to talk. Yeah. What Nicola Willis and Luxon are trying to say here, they're trying to say that they're taking a balanced approach. This isn't an austerity budget. I mean, how do you respond to that?
Thousands of New Zealanders every day live in austerity, and it's going to grow as a result of this budget. If you're a superannuitant, you're going to be about $2.50 better off as a result of this budget. But remember, you didn't get an inflation-adjusted increment this year. I think that's particularly, Liam, if I put my political lens on, that's particularly going to hit New Zealand first. They are their core supporters, and I think Winston and Shane have let them down. No, this will further entrench poverty in Aotearoa New Zealand and austerity that too many of our, particularly our kids, are living in, Liam. I think it's a sad day for all of us.
Yeah, I mean, there was big protest today. Māori iwi groups were out there. Was there anything in the budget you saw that for the Māori community?
I haven't done that analysis. I see the bit of extra funding for Matatini, but it's all about bread and butter. And Māori, considering the fact that we earn 10% less than our Pākehā counterparts, will be worse off as a result of this. Can I also say, Liam, I went and saw the march today. It was supported by Māori, working people, Te Tiriti partners, and I think that this government has uncorked something that they do not expect, and I think that movement will grow, particularly as times get tough. I think that this is going to be an economic winter of discontent.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the job politically is Nicola Willis and Christopher Luxon have to go out there and sell this budget. How do you think they will fare in terms of, I get they're trying to. I would say they're trying to sort of shed a little bit of the baggage that they've had from their coalition partners and present themselves front and centre on this. Does it ring true as a sort of a national party budget, do you think?
Yeah, I think it does. I think they'll get a pretty good reception from the Chamber of Commerce, but not maybe down at the local RSA or at the local supermarket. Even if you're on $100,000, $20 does not go any way in terms of meeting inflation. Prescription charges have gone up, registrations have gone up, public transport initiatives cut, so people will not be better off as a result of this budget.
Yeah, I'm just going to look at the tax brackets here and what people were getting. So we're looking at how many people will get what size tax cut, estimated number of people and size of annual tax cuts based on 2022 income tax data. So less than $100, 30,000 people getting less than $100 a year. The biggest group there I can see is 1.7 million people getting between $100 and $200 a year.
Yes.
The second biggest group is 876,000 people getting that 1,000 to 1,043 a year. That's your $20 a week, isn't it?
$1.6 million. 1.6 million New Zealanders getting $200 a year more. That's pathetic. That's sad.
Yeah, and again, the thresholds here. So the thresholds moved to current threshold at 10.5 is 14,000. That moves to 15,600. At 17.5, we go from 14,000. The current threshold goes 14,000 to 48,000, and that will move to 15,601 to 53,500. 30% tax rate kicks in 48,000 to 70,000 currently, and will now kick in at 53,500 to 78,100. And the 33% tax rate goes 70,001 through to 180, and that of course stays the same from there on up.
But Liam, here's another stat. Unemployment is at 4.3. Looks like it's going to hit about 5. And that means another 29,000 unemployed, which means if we use the base calculation, 10,000 more Māori unemployed, it's going to be a tough time for those folks. So, you can look at some of these fundamental stats, but as I say, Liam, and I'm not just saying this as a left-wing sort of pundit, I think this is going to be a winter of discontent. And I think the problem that the coalition partners are going to have is that David's people will not be happy, because there is that borrowing
deficit,
and superannuitants who are Winston's core supporters will not be happy because they're only going to be $2.50 better off as a result of this budget. But remember, they did not get an inflation adjusted increase in April.
Right. Well, thank you, Shane. That is definitely going to be a big job for Nicola Willis and Christopher Luxon to get out there and sell this budget. We are going to wrap up the show now. Just a reminder that the government has delivered on that promise to cut taxes. It will be looking like for middle and upper income earners about $20 extra a week. We are looking at being back in surplus if the government can make all the cuts it's going to have to make in 27-28, and there will be another $12 billion worth of borrowing. Nicola Willis again emphasising they're not borrowing for the tax cuts, they're borrowing to keep doing stuff because they'll also be down on revenue because of the tax cuts. But look, money going back into people's pockets, many people's pockets, that will be something for the government to push. The Reserve Bank, of course, will be looking closely at it to make sure it's not adding to inflation and making their job more difficult, because if it does, it could keep interest rates higher for longer. But having said that, it's a difficult position this government finds itself in, and it's attempting to find a balanced pathway through it. We will see how they go on selling it. Thank you all for being here, for listening. Stay on the New Zealand Herald website. There will be more commentary, more analysis throughout the afternoon, and more video with reaction from politicians post parliamentary session. So thanks again, and we'll leave it there. Cheers.